So, folks, we have Questlines coming to Hearthstone here in the very near future, and it's almost certain at least a couple of these are going to see some degree of play and be relevant to the upcoming Hearthstone meta. That generally happens when you got big game-changing sorts of cards like these. So, of course, I wanted to lock in my predictions for which ones are going to be the best, which ones are going to be the most game-changing, so that we can all come back here in 3-4 months and make fun of how stupid I looked. As we head into the rankings, I'd like to thank our sponsor for this video, Keeps, which we'll talk about a little more later. But for now, let's kick things off with number 10, the worst of the quest lines. Yeah, in the 10th spot here is Demon Hunter. And I gotta say, I didn't think this one would be that great originally, but after seeing it in action during the Theory Crafting stream, I've reconfirmed those suspicions, because I think this one's just too awkward. It's still a little more difficult than I think people are expecting to get these steps for this quest complete. You really have to commit a lot of mana and a big part of your turn to draw 5 cards, or really sort of 4 additional cards in a single turn. The cost reductions aren't individually enough per card to, I think, really recover any of that tempo, unlike a card like Skull of Gul'dan. And then the Demon Slayer Kurtrus payoff is... it's interesting. Of course, discounts like that are cool, but again, still less of a discount than Skull of Gul'dan. You still need more card draw to really benefit from it quickly. So all in all, you've got this loop that's happening where you're just constantly trying to spend your mana drawing cards and not recovering enough mana discounts to really make up for the fact that you're spending all that time and energy playing towards a quest reward that just makes you do the same sort of thing over and over again. So when we saw opponents trying to play this, it felt like they either couldn't really get the card draw done without maybe being dead or not reacting to the board. And then even after they did, like, no cards left in deck sometimes to actually benefit from it. So finding a list that combines the right pieces, like tradable cards, glide, there's maybe some OTK stuff here that happens where you just care about the front half of this, and it's like it's an efficient Octobot or something, and that's like the only reason you play it. Maybe the card gets played just for the first step or two and you don't even push towards Kurtrus, but ultimately I think that just sacrifices another card in your opening hand. I'm not sure that payoff's worth it. So all in all, this feels awkward and low payoff to the extent that I just don't see many decks making room for it. Moving on to the number 9 spot here, it's Mage, and this one's a little surprising. Just after playing with quests a little more and kind of getting a feel for, completing these steps, I think 3-part steps are going to be really tough for this one. And 3-part steps in particular that demand very specific sorts of plays. So, after playing particularly like Priest and Warriors quests, sometimes it was really hard to get those steps done. And, for Warrior, that's just playing Pirates, right? It's not anything crazy. There's no conditions. For Priest, getting the right things lined up sometimes was a little more difficult. I think for Mage, it's actually going to be even harder because you got to get a Fire, Frost, and Arcane spell. So I haven't played this one specifically, but I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of times you're sitting and not getting this quest done. And although the payoff, I think, is really nice, spell damage +3 is, very significant. I wonder if it'll come too late in the game where the game's pretty much already decided by the time you get Dawn Grasp completed, and therefore it just doesn't feel worth it. So I think this one's going to be really slow and really awkward, and building a deck around it's going to be a little bit too tough for the foreseeable future. So unfortunately, another one that's probably not going to get played a lot. So next up here is the Warrior quest, and I never would have put this here 2 days ago. I thought this was going to be a pretty sick quest, but after having played with it some and seeing other people play it, I think this card lands in a really awkward spot. Basically, the reward for this and the steps towards completing it in some ways, because you're playing, a 1-drop that's not a tempo play, leave this card in this spot where it's kind of a mix between an aggro card and almost a control card. And I tried to build like a mid-range pirate list that sort of fused those two worlds together. So you got some fast pirates, you got some mid-game to make sure you can stretch a game out long enough to really take advantage of the Juggernaut, because it's better the longer the game goes on, right? It increases in value over time. Over a single turn or two, maybe not that exciting of a reward. Over 5 turns, suddenly, it cranks out a lot of stuff, and that seemed like the way to play. But like the rest of the pirate package is, much more aggressive and kind of you run out of gas. I think there's maybe a world where you build this towards control and you just have some pirates in a control deck and use Juggernaut as a value generator. But even that's not really super well fitting to the pirate game plan. So in other words, do you make this a really hard tempo deck? Then the Juggernaut's maybe not that synergistic. It takes too long to really get value and you might be better off just running an aggressive 1-drop. Do you build it towards control? In that case, pirates aren't perfect. Maybe there's better ways to play control. Felt like mid-range was still just a little too awkward. Maybe there aren't quite enough pirates. There's just a handful of different things holding Raid the Docks back. I still want to root for this card. I think it's really cool. I'm going to try to make this work in a variety of different ways, but I have a feeling it's just living in between these archetypal spaces and won't end up actually being worth it. When you really decide to push for a certain direction, there might just be better cards than Raid the Docks. So next up here is Rise to the Occasion, a card I think would have been lower on my list initially, but I'm actually seeing in a better light after having played it. Number one, there were a lot of concerns people had that you were going to have to play 9 unique cards for this one. As I originally suspected and as I reviewed it, indeed, we confirmed that each step resets. You can play like a Pinflinger in each step, and it will still count. You don't have to play 9 different 1-drops, which really helps the feasibility of getting this done, which is nice. Also, we got some great cards to help support it. There's like the Blessed Goods, there's First Day of School. It wasn't hard at all, I didn't think, to get this done. We were usually getting this done on like turn 6, turn 5 even, pretty consistently. And then I felt like the payoff was actually rather nice. There are a handful of cards in Standard right now to build immediately significant boards the turn after playing Cariel, and she's not a chump herself as a 5-mana 7/7. So it didn't take long to really leverage the advantage of this. Just summoning those 3/3 boards 2-3 turns in a row really started to grind down a lot of opponents. So in my mind, it was pretty fast, had a good payoff. It's looking like a pretty good quest. That said, still very narrow in its focus. It's still just stats on board. It's not instantly game winning like some of the other options we have. So I don't know if this deck will be good enough compared to the meta, right? But it feels, cohesive and quicker than expected. So pretty hopeful for this one. So even though it's like, kind of farther down this list, still think this is a solid card. We're ranking quests. They could all be good, right? And still be the worst. So I think this will be fine, pretty solid, just not like tier 1. So next up here is the Rogue quest. And this is another one that's gained some points for me after having seen it in action, because I think it's just one of the higher tempo quests. A lot of these take a long time. You got to grind stuff out. It takes a lot of work. This one doesn't take that much work. You just got to play a few SI7 cards. And then you get these really nice gizmos. And the gizmos, they're not the most powerful rewards in the world, but they're cheap. They're 1 mana, and they're very swingy when you play them. They're often making significant impacts on the game. And then Scabs himself, like, that's a pretty big 2-turn punch. Like, you've played a faster game plan. You drop a Scabs. That's pretty big and hard to deal with. And then the next turn, you have 5 gizmos that can really swing a game in your favor for a variety of reasons. Remove something big from your opponent, develop some minions, disrupt them. And that was a pretty powerful 1-2 punch, basically. It felt like when opponents were playing this against us. The risk for this one, of course, is that our SI7 card is going to be good enough. You have to build completely around Scabs with SI7 cards. And I think that's the real thing that's going to keep this one in check. It's got the nice payoff, but it's going to have to be the best version of Rogue, because you don't want to have to commit all these otherwise mediocre cards. So if that 1-2 punch or that swing turn off Scabs and his gizmos isn't enough, this deck's just going to fall away immediately, because you don't want to run all this other garbage in your deck that's maybe not strong enough. And I have to say the SI7 cards really didn't feel great from what I saw. So, it might just be one of those. It's like certain metas, this lines up fine, and then other times it's just utter garbage because the SI7 cards cannot compete. But I think that the high tempo aspect of this bumped it up a spot or two, whereas before I thought this might end up being the worst of the quests. All right, so now let's talk about our sponsor for this video. It's Keeps. Yeah, if you didn't know, 2 out of 3 guys will experience some form of male pattern baldness by the time they're 35. I am personally 34, so this is very top of mind for me. And the best way to prevent hair loss, really kind of the only way, is to do something about it while you still have some left. And the cool thing is with keeps, you can get it sent right to your door. You don't have to head to the doctor for the prescription. They'll mail it right to you, which is as easy, safe, and convenient as it can get these days. So if you're noticing that you're losing your hair, do something about it. For a limited time, you can go to keeps.com/Regis or click the link in the description down below to receive 50% off your first order. So next up is Priest Quest, and we played this one a fair bit. I never actually got to Purified Shard in the theory crafting streams where I was playing these early, but I don't think that's a problem necessarily or indicative that this is a bad quest, because I didn't really have the environment where that's going to be important, where you're playing in a control mirror match or against another priest. Basically, there's sort of like a prisoner's dilemma almost here, where if you're going to be playing control priest in a meta and that's a popular deck, or there's control warriors or control warlocks or whatever, you need to have that defined win condition, because if you're not running it, the other guy might be. We've seen this in the past actually with like warriors running like Archivist Elysiana, when control warrior and Archivist Elysiana were good. They didn't need that card for any matchup except the other control warrior, but because control warrior was good, you had to run Archivist Elysiana to make sure you had enough cards to beat the other guys playing control warrior. I think Purified Shard and Seek Guidance will actually fall in a similar spot, and I don't think it's much of a sacrifice to run this card in a control priest. You give up that first draw, but you recover it pretty easily with the discover a card from your deck rewards along the way. Zyrella herself is certainly not a terrible play as a 5-mana 7/7 taunt. So you're not giving up much for your control game plan, but you're gaining this like guaranteed win condition in certain matchups. Maybe it still gets ticketed occasionally or whatever, right? But you have the option to play towards this. So what I think that means is if Control Priest is at all a relevant deck, and we played this very successfully, I would say, in the Zoth Priest in particular, that was a nice fit for all these different curve cards. You just toss this in. It's not what you're building the deck around. It's not fundamentally important necessarily, but it's just kind of a freebie and a solid card and a win condition to boot. So I think it'll see some meta play, even if it's not the reason you're playing that deck. It's still just a part of it. Moving on to Demonseed. I like this quest so much. I don't even really care if this one's good. I think it's so fun. This is like one of the most fun decks I've ever played, I think. This constant balancing between life and death, and then having this insane payoff where you can just blow your opponent up with fatigue damage or whatever other sort of self-damage you want. I think fatigue's probably going to be the way to go, but we'll see where this lands over time. And I gotta say, I don't know, it didn't feel as hard to finish as I thought, and it didn't feel as hard to stay alive as I thought. I played it in an unrefined meta, of course, where people weren't maybe playing the most polished aggro deck, so it might be harder to stay alive in those scenarios. So maybe this one will fall away a little bit, but I think the payoff is just so significant and so good that cards like this still tend to make room, right? Like, it's just blowing people up with an OTK is very cool once you've gotten to fatigue. So this could be something that like shuts out control decks, because you just have this infinite damage output from your fatigue essentially, as long as it can stay alive at all. And I think there's enough stabilization cards in Warlock to stay alive against a lot of decks. So in other words, I think the payoff here is worth the risks, and it's such a well-defined win condition that it's going to carve out a spot. Next up is Druid's Quest, and this is another one of those that's getting all of its points because it's such a significantly high tempo quest. And I gotta say, when people are playing this against me, it felt really good. It's just pumping out damage. It's got survivability on top of that, so it's really good when it comes to racing things like aggro decks. And then Guff the Tough is a big play when it hits for only 5 mana. It's again just so swingy. It's like, I was looking at these games and it's like, man, we took like 15, 20 damage. I'm at like 10 health, but the opponent's got like 20 armor. It just feels like you're so beaten down, and they're not really sacrificing much to advance the quest either. So I think this is going to be a very fast, aggressive, high output quest that just in some ways might surprise people, but could still all the same take the meta by storm. And speaking of taking things by storm, this is the Shaman quest. And this looked good when people were playing it, I gotta say. I think it's not as hard to complete as people thought. There's a lot of cheap overload cards. Lightning Bloom alone really seems to fuel this one. And the payoff is very powerful with Stormcaller Brucon. You can even play this in faster decks using like weapon damage off the Brucon. I think you could play this in control decks too, just stabilize really hard with tons of healing or removal. And, you know, it's all similarly themed with Overload, so you can commit to a nice cohesive package to get it done. So I think this is going to be a very good way to build around in Shaman, and maybe a frustrating card to lose to, and sometimes because it can do some crazy broken stuff. I think this is going to be very, very strong. But number one here, I got to give to Hunter. It's the return of Raza Anduin Priest, but it's in a class that's even better at going face. Yeah, Hunter's Quest, you got to deal some damage with spells, then you get Tavish, and Tavish lets you just spam machine gun your hero power. And I think this is going to be just probably too good. First off, not hard to complete. Dealing damage with spells is super easy in Hunter. There's a ton of very affordable ways to do that. People were getting this done shockingly quick. There were multiple times where I was like, wait, they already have their Tavish? They're playing a 7/7 and then just start spamming hero powers against me like crazy, finding all kinds of just absurd damage outs. This is giving, you know, a bazooka to a class that was already great at blowing things up. And I think this is going to make them even better. This is reminiscent of one of the most powerful and frustrating decks of all time that had to get super nerfed. And by God, we might be seeing a repeat of that, because I think Tavish is going to be very, very powerful. And this Hunter deck is going to be really, really good, making it the #1 quest. All right, there you go, folks. That wraps it up for my quest line rankings. What did you think about this? How wrong am I going to be? Share those thoughts in the comments below. Lock in those predictions so we can all come back and smugly gloat over one another in the near future, or at least, you know, mock me endlessly in the comments, as you guys so often love to do. That said, thanks much for watching, and until next time, game on.